Good day to you. My name is Kyle Davian. Welcome to part 2 of the audio version of the novel The Holler by Kyle Davian. Let's get started. Part 1, The Town. Chapter 1, Sub 1. The town hated him. Always had. Even though they did not say things to him straight to his face, they were eager to say them behind his back. Oh yes, there were the rumors. There had always been the rumors. And what of them? They were unnerving at best. But still he had to venture outside the safe haven of his home and do his duty. "May God bless you and keep you," he said, raising his hands over the offering as he bid peace to the church congregation. The members of the audience quickly took their communion and bid their farewells. The father, Michael Allen, shook hands with all the small number present and tried to exhale as little as possible. "God be with you," he said in a soft voice as he locked the door behind the last to leave. Then, sighing deeply with relief, he ran his fingers through his blond hair and pulled a small flask out from under his cloak and took a long, deep swallow of the burning alcoholic contents. He lit a cigarette, well aware he shouldn't have, not with his history of breathing problems. "Fuck you," he muttered under his breath. He hated them all. Sub 2. David Alexander ran faster than the other kids, trailing hopelessly behind him. The youngster was heading the line of small boys who were racing for the Holler Springs. Each one was eager to find out who would be the first to arrive at the spring's natural watering hole, although deep in their hearts they knew that David would be the first one there. He always was. They passed countless trees and wildlife as they ran along the narrow woodland trail. During the race, a bird or a tree branch would swoop down in front of them and delay them for a moment or so, but soon they would regenerate themselves and start off once again. Before long, David entered a clearing in the woods, and soon he found himself facing the rippling waters. One by one, the other boys caught up with him, soon stopping in their tracks behind their leader. With a loud war cry, David jumped onto a trail of large flat rocks which lined the ford in the river. Then, leading the others, he walked the line of formations to the opposite side. Once on the opposite side, the group of boys began to savagely remove their clothing, tossing them carelessly along the muddy creek bank. As they ran along the continuation of the trail, clad only in their birthday suits, they began to yell out their boldness. By the time the trail ended at another small clearing, each boy was ready for action. David was the first one to take a flying leap into the small body of water, followed by a long line of restless naked youths. Cool water splashed in all directions as the weight of the boys met the surface. Once inside, they began to squirt water playfully at one another, ignoring the obvious fact that they were all completely naked, as only boys could be expected to do. David, the oldest of the group, suddenly jumped out of the water, followed by two younger boys. The three then disappeared to the nearby woods, leaving their friends' childish laughter behind them. The others remained in the water, completely unbiased, continuing their games of laughter and youth. Sub 3. Sub 3. Mrs. Jane Packnett walked into Gruber's General, carrying her usual cloth shopping bag. "Howdy, Jane," Ray Gruber greeted her with a wave of his hand. "Howdy, Ray. Got anything special today?" "You betcha, Missy. Saved this in here just for you." He reached under the counter, brought out a thin metal sewing tin. He leaned over and handed it to her with a thoughtful grin. "For me?" "You betcha, Missy. Well, Jane, aren't you going to open it?" "Why, yes, Ray. I didn't mean to be so rude." She reached for the container lid and immediately cracked a smile as she tilted her head to sniff the homemade fruit cake that lay inside the canister. "Barbara made it especially for you," he beamed with pride. She smiled and reached for his hand. "How thoughtful. Thanks a million, Ray. Tell your wife that I'll bring her something as soon as I can." "Now, you know you don't have to. It was her pleasure. You also coming to the celebration tonight, Jane? Why, yes, Arthur, me, and the kids wouldn't miss it for the world. Good, he grinned. I'll let you get back to your affairs now. They exchanged good days and then went on about their business. Sub 4. Lisa and Robert Kent firmly held hands, leaning against one another as they patiently walked the winding woodland trail. Autumn had arrived early, and the evidence was all around them. Full trees of dense patches of leaves and flower blossoms leaned lazily as the wind gently blew by them, carrying their sense of heavenly floral delights. Lisa sighed deeply, filling her senses with a natural fantasy. Robert began to nibble on her ear, and she giggled in approval. Soon she also found himself in delights. Without a clue, he pulled Lisa to the side of the trail, down into what seemed at first to be only a huge shapeless bush. Beyond what at first seemed to have been only a bush, however, lay an area of grassy floor, completely domed by a natural roof of wild, flower-bearing vines. Robert bent over to separate some entangled branches, forming a small opening, tugging impatiently at Lisa to join him inside the green dome of heavenly sights and scents. The two entered and seated themselves inside the middle of the secluded natural wonderland. Lisa smiled, a gleam in her eyes, then leaned over and merged her lips with her husband's in a warm and tender kiss. Soon their arms enveloped each other, as did nature itself. The location of their shy young boy, Job, did not seem to matter. And there the two remained, on the soft floor of the domed paradise, making young love, totally unaware and unnoticed by the rest of the world. Sub 5. Old Mrs. Rugby sat attentively in her wheelchair, listening carefully to the words of Mabel Perkins. The two elderly widows had each lost their husbands by the hands of fate many years before, and somehow they both now felt that each owed the other their utmost loyalty. They were very inactive in the town's social affairs, and many were surprised to even find them sitting underneath the huge oak tree that proudly stood in the center of the town square. The two women were known to squander the little time they had left gossiping about every little event that went on in the holler. And in a town where not many things did happen, many were surprised to discover that the two always found something new each day to talk about. On that bright and sunny day, the two old women miraculously made their appearance publicly known. Many citizens began to casually pass them by, perhaps in sheer bewilderment, making certain that they did nothing to start the two gossiping about something they had supposedly done. Old Mrs. Rugby sat leaning in her wheelchair, her hands shaking, reaching for the tall glass of iced tea that Mrs. Perkins had just poured her. The two then began to swiftly consume their cold drinks, just as if they had worked up a hearty thirst for them. Actually, gossiping did require much energy from each of their elderly bodies. Where old Mrs. Rugby couldn't go, Mabel Perkins took her. The two were great compromisers. Mabel would be old Mrs. Rugby's legs, whereas she, in turn, would be Mabel Perkins' ears. Because she wasn't capable of walking, old Mrs. Rugby had developed all her senses very well, that is, all except her eyesight. That had given up on her quite some time ago. Sub 6. Ray Gruber had extra supplies shipped in for the city that morning, and he spent nearly all of it sorting and stocking the special goods. Since he was the only merchant in town, he was expected to have an ample supply and selection of the goods that the Hollers, as they were called, would be needing for the celebration. And while he did in fact own and operate a general store, along with his wife Barbara, many were inclined to call it a small-scale department store. Mr. Gruber always had in stock items that people would be needing and would otherwise have to travel to some larger town to obtain. He was on a rollaway ladder placing cans of peaches on a top shelf when Mabel Perkins walked in. the cowbell over the front entrance, loudly announcing her sudden presence. Upon hearing this, Mr. Gruber turned around to acknowledge her. "Howdy, Mabel," he beamed. "Howdy, Ray," she replied in an almost monotone manner. "Well, what can I do for you today, Missy? As if I had to ask." "Oh, I didn't come by to stock up for the celebration, Ray, if that's what you mean." "I thought not, you old penny pincher. You'd rather wait and see what you can get for free at the celebration. Maybe some nice free gossip." "You didn't," he replied, trying to look surprised. "No, you see, I seem to run out of tea." "What else but? It's no wonder when your fat self and old Mrs. Rugby are sitting neath that old tree in the square, drinking away like there's about to be a sudden extinction of moisture." "I see," he said. "Well, I've got a whole collection you can choose from. I got a big shipment in this morning for the city." With that, he stepped down from the ladder he was on and led her to the opposite side of the store. "Right there," he directed, pointing to a middle shelf in the aisle. "There's about 100 kinds of tea there, sort of, at least enough to have a selection from." "Well, I am surprised. It's even better than what I used to carry years ago when I had my mercantile." She was obviously pleased. "Now let me see. I mustn't take too long, you know. Poor Judith is sitting outside in the hot sun all by herself. I think I'll just take this packet of instant tea." She reached down and grasped the packet, then scrambled, as she always did, inside the depths of her purse for the money. "Here you go," she said, dropping some coins onto his outstretched hand. "I sort of miss competing with you business to business, like in the old days. Don't you?" Ignoring the comment, he replied, "Much obliged, Mrs. Perkins. Y'all have a nice day." With that, he watched as she scurried out the door to where old Mrs. Rugby was waiting on the square lawn, and he couldn't help wondering at that moment what she would look like with a noose wrapped around her chubby neck. Sub 7. The sun had dropped considerably in the sky since that afternoon, and by late afternoon, most of the residents of the Holler had left the town square to go home and prepare for that evening's festivities. That is, except everyone, of course, but Mrs. Perkins and old Mrs. Rugby. They would do as they did every year on that special day. The two would remain seated underneath the huge oak tree and waited till everyone returned later on to decorate and set up for the party. They always wanted to be the first ones there. That was their tradition, as it had become with the people of the Holler. Then, as soon as someone had seen that they had been the first to arrive, they would then leave and return later on after everything had been set up and the celebration was in full swing. The huge oak tree that the two sat under had a special legend all its own. It was said that a brutal rapist had been hung on the largest of its limbs many years ago when the Holler was still in its infancy. It is said it had been a young boy who had savagely attacked and raped a young girl in the nearby woods. Of course, no one was quite certain that the event had ever really taken place, mainly because the few participants of the public hanging were now dead, and attempts to find out exactly what happened to the boy and his victim were quickly deterred. It was a bad piece of history that the town never officially acknowledged nor denied. Probably the only person who did know, they rumored, was old Mrs. Rugby. Sub 8. Jane Packard had been busy baking pies of various flavors ever since her return from Gruber's earlier that afternoon. Her twins, younger son Billy and older daughter Julie, suddenly ventured to the kitchen, sniffing deeply, unable to withstand avoiding the delicious scents that continually drifted throughout the house. "Mommy, it smells good," Billy commented. "Yeah," agreed his sister Julie. "Nice try, kids, but nobody touches them pies till later on tonight at the celebration." "Well, we tried," said Julie, shrugging her shoulders in defeat. Billy repeated the gesture he had seen his sister do, and then left to catch up with her. Mrs. Packnett was humming to herself while she trimmed some edges off of a pie when someone placed two rough hands over her eyes. "Guess who?" a man's voice cooed. Romeo, it's about time. Are you sure my boyfriend is gone? It'd be awful if he came in here and caught us. Her comments were cut short by her boyfriend Arthur, who removed his hands from atop her shoulders and instead lowered them to her waistline. She turned around to face him, placing her powdery hands around his muscular neck and then merging her lips with his in a tender kiss. She quickly glanced up and down his broad, healthy body and his curly mass of hair. I think I would have liked Romeo better. He gave a much better kiss. She was again silenced by a second kiss, this one being much more aggressive. Arthur pulled back her long blonde hair and smiled at her. Does he do better than that? He asked. Well, she giggled. With that, he began to playfully chase her around the kitchen while she released squeals of girlish laughter. I'm going to kiss your boobies when I catch up with you, he vowed. And after hearing this, Jane packed and made it a little bit easier for him to catch her. While Ray Gruber rushed to finish helping the customers that soon crowded his shop, others in the holler were busy in their homes preparing for that evening's festivities. Scents of baking fruit and simmering meats drifted about around the homes while children obedient played outdoors as they had been warned, eagerly waiting the moment when their families would be arriving at the celebration. Silhouettes of women rushing back and forth with dishes and pans in their hands were cast upon kitchen windows, the urge too strong to ignore any longer. But the shades were soon drawn in their faces, and they returned to their games as they were told, the sun falling behind the horizon and creating sinister, shadowy play areas. The children of the holler had grown up with the darkness, and many of the evening activities accounted for much of their exposure to the night. No child feared the darkness, and parents were quick to keep this fact intact. One by one, lights slowly faded, and the sounds of voices could be heard as families gathered their belongings and began to make their way in small groups toward the town square. The sounds of busy feet were everywhere, except for their destination. Among the huge, towering trees stood tiki torches, shedding soft, glowing light upon the immediate area. And right in the center of it all stood the huge oak tree with decorations surrounding it. Beside the lighted tree sat old Mrs. Rugby and Mabel Perkins, quietly sipping their tea and exchanging bits of gossip, because soon it would be time for them to leave. This concludes this episode of The Holler by Caldavian. Join us for the next episode, Part 2, The Celebration.